Welcome to today's lesson where we're going to talk about plasma exchange, and specifically we're going to talk about the types of fluids that you can give to someone who's receiving plasma exchange. Now, as the name implies, you are switching something for the patient's plasma, and so we have a few solutions that we can give, and we're going to go over some of the pros and cons of each solution. The first thing we ought to discuss is not giving anything. So just removing plasma and not administering anything in its place. So there's many problems with that strategy, and this is a strategy that's not commonly used. And one of the problems is that you can develop hypotension because you're taking out such a significant amount of plasma and not returning anything back. You're at higher risk of developing a lower blood pressure. And specifically what happens is you're taking away so much of the protein that's in plasma, so much of the quote osmoles that are in plasma, that you're leaving the patient with very little osmotic pressure to maintain their systemic arterial blood pressure. So this is a result of not repleting osmoles. Now, I did mention just now that you're taking away a lot of proteins, and one of the proteins that you are taking away, or one group of proteins, are the coagulation factors. So when you do plasma exchange, you are decreasing the coagulation factor concentration that a patient has, and that predisposes the patient for bleeding. So these are the two main complications you get with plasma exchange if you don't administer any solution back to the patient. So let's talk about one of the more common solutions to give back, and that's normal saline. Now, normal saline has some pros and cons. One of the pros is that it is a great arterial blood pressure resuscitator. In other words, it has enough osmoles to increase your blood pressure. So it'll maintain that blood pressure because it has the osmoles that the body needs to maintain an osmotic gradient. But it does not have proteins. In other words, the osmoles that are in normal saline are not proteinaceous. They're ions like sodium and chloride, for example. So without those proteins, you're not going to replenish the coagulation factors that you've removed, and so your risk of bleeding is high. Alright. Third, this is cheap. Normal saline is probably the cheapest replenishment fluid that you can give to someone on plasma exchange. But you've got some other fluids that you can administer as well, and let's pick another one here. Albumin. So we did say that the osmoles that are being removed are proteinaceous, and so this would restore your blood pressure because it would give you back some osmoles. Now, as we know from other studies, commonly in the critical care literature and perhaps even in the surgical literature, the ability to maintain blood pressure using albumin is equivalent to the ability of maintaining blood pressure using normal saline. Although it's commonly thought that albumin has a greater effect at increasing the osmotic pressure in the vasculature, there's a lot of studies that show that normal saline and albumin are perhaps equal in their ability to resuscitate blood pressure. And in some cases, normal saline is better at resuscitating blood pressure because it can be administered much faster, and there's less of an opportunity for degradation of those osmoles. You don't have to degrade sodium or chloride, but you will have some degradation of albumin, and as a result lose that osmotic gradient. So keep in mind that these two right here may be equal to each other. Albumin is not a coagulation factor, so you're still going to have a higher risk of bleeding. And finally, it would be useful if albumin were cheap, but it's not. Albumin is a little more costly than normal saline. So you may wonder, why give albumin if you're getting the same effect at a cheaper price with normal saline. And that's a very good inference to make, or assessment to make. Normal saline is actually preferred to be administered in plasma exchange if all you want to do is maintain blood pressure and you're willing to accept the higher bleeding risk. So albumin is not an ideal solution to give back to someone who's getting plasma exchange. Now, let's see if we have any more real estate here. We don't. So let's erase some of this and talk about one of the last replacement fluids. So we talked about normal saline, we talked about albumin, we talked about how normal saline will probably get the same job done as if you had given albumin, so it'll be a little hard for you to justify albumin when you have normal saline, which is cheaper. And then you have FFP. So what is that? So FFP can maintain your blood pressure because it has a number of proteins. So it has the osmoles that you're looking for, which will increase your osmotic pressure in the vasculature. But FFP has the coagulation factors, so it decreases your risk of bleeding. FFP is not cheap. It might be even more expensive than albumin, so we'll say it's the most expensive of all the fluids. And FFP is a blood product. What that means is that if you continue to administer this blood product, you will have a reaction. Let's put that down. So you'll have an allergic reaction. Now, the allergic reaction can be severe or it could be mild. Mild symptoms would just include a rash and itchiness, maybe something that looks like hives, for example. But you could have severe reaction like anaphylaxis and anaphylactic shock, such that you'd have to absolutely terminate the plasma exchange and the administration of FFP. So you've got three solutions. Most of them do the same things in the sense that they maintain your blood pressure, but only one decreases your risk of bleeding, that's FFP. The other two, normal saline and albumin, don't really adjust your risk for bleeding. The first two, normal saline and albumin, are much cheaper than FFP. And of course, the only one that could predispose you to an allergic reaction, or at least at a high enough risk, is FFP. There's some evidence that albumin itself can predispose you, but FFP is more likely to give you an allergic reaction than normal saline or albumin. So the question then is, when you're administering plasma exchange and you've decided that you have to give something, that nothing is unacceptable, which one of these are you going to choose? And that'll primarily depend on the disease that you're treating. In most cases, when you use plasma exchange, you don't need to give FFP. The disease process isn't modified by giving FFP. Let's take, for example, a disease. And in this case, we'll talk about myasthenia gravis. So in myasthenia gravis, you have an abnormal production of antibodies that attack at the neuromuscular junction. So you've got pathologic antibodies that need to be removed. And of course, plasma exchange, whether you do it via centrifugation or membrane permeability separator, which we discussed in a previous lesson, will remove these pathologic antibodies. Now, what do you replace with in plasma exchange in myasthenia gravis? You have to give something that restores the blood pressure, and in that sense, you have three things at your disposal. You have normal saline, you have albumin, and you have FFP. So any one of these three will restore your blood pressure, but you also have this issue of higher risk of bleeding. You could give FFP to mitigate that, and in some cases, when you do prolong plasma exchange for a disease such as myasthenia gravis, you will give some FFP to mitigate the risk for bleeding, but administration of FFP by itself will not alter the course of this disease. Therefore, if you're talking about bleeding, one strategy to take when administering plasma exchange is to start off with either normal saline or albumin. And if you have prolonged use of plasma exchange, say more than 4, 5, or 6 sessions, then you're going to want to intersperse with some FFP. So that's a good strategy to take when you're working with a disease. And here we chose Myasthenia gravis, but this disease represents any disease that doesn't change in its morbidity by administration of coagulation products like FFP. Now let's take another disease before we wrap up this session, one that does change based on the administration of FFP, and that's of course the classic disease that you're all familiar with. TTP. So in TTP, you have probably one of two things, if not both, occurring. You have an antibody or some type of proteinaceous material that's targeted against von Willebrand's factor, and you have a decrease in a protein that's necessary to make von Willebrand's factor. So what does plasmapheresis accomplish for you in this case? Well, if you perform plasmapheresis, you're going to eliminate any potential antibody or proteinaceous material that's attacking either this protein or the von Willebrand's factor protein. I'm going to use that interchangeably, although we know that's not truly the case. But for our purposes, that's fine. But you also want to replenish any of this that's missing. And this protein is commonly found in FFP. So you could perform plasma exchange. And you've got a blood pressure requirement which can be easily met by giving FFP. But you could also give normal saline or albumin. There's no difference here. But you want to replenish any deficiency of this protein. So you would administer then just FFP to accomplish this task. So for the therapy of TTP, when you're using plasma exchange, you not only want to remove the antibody that's being produced or that protein that's being produced, but you want to replenish anything that you're missing, any deficiency that's needed for proper coagulation. And FFP accomplishes both of those tasks. Moreover, it will help mitigate any hypotension, which is a complication of plasma exchange, and if you continue to do plasma exchange for a long period of time, you're going to run into a depletion of coagulation factors, which FFP nicely replenishes. So in cases such as TTP or HUS, FFP is your best replacement fluid for a patient who's receiving plasma exchange. And that's today's lesson. Thank you very much.